The first thing you notice is the quiet. An old, winter-shaped quiet that settles over the forest like a long breath held between dusk and dawn. The snow has grown thick along the pines, the air moves slowly, and every sound feels softened, as if the world itself has been wrapped in wool. In that stillness, a small clearing waits, holding the shape of a bunkhouse, built not for comfort, but for survival. And it is here, at the edge of a frozen timberland, that the night's story begins. The northern forests of Wisconsin in the late 19th century were not places people visited. They were places people entered with intention, knowing the season would close behind them like a door. Winter transformed everything. The ground hardened beneath layers of ice. The trees stood like tall, patient silhouettes, and the trails disappeared under snowdrifts that erased all sense of distance. For the lumberjacks who lived and worked here, the forest was not a backdrop. It was a world with its own rules, its own rhythms, and its own quiet companionship. Every winter, these men built long, low bunkhouses deep within the woods. They shaped them from the very trees they planned to cut, setting logs onto stone foundations and sealing every gap against the wind. Inside, the air warmed slowly each night as an iron stove glowed at the center of the room. Boots dried along the walls, wool softened above the fire, and the faint scent of pine smoke lingered in the rafters. It was a simple kind of shelter, bare floors, wooden bunks, dim lantern light, but in the frozen months it became the small, steady heart of the camp. Outside, the forest held its vastness. Inside, life moved at a quiet pace. Mornings began before sunrise with the ring of an iron triangle, and nights ended with the slow unwinding of tired bodies settling into bunks. Between those moments lay hours of labor, the steady warmth of shared meals, and the silent understanding that survival depended as much on routine as on strength. This was winter in the logging camps, calm, deliberate, and patient. And tonight we return to that world, one slow step at a time. The northern forests of Wisconsin in the late 19th century stretched outward like an endless quilt of white and pine. Winter did not arrive suddenly, it settled gradually, beginning with a quiet coolness in the mornings, then a faint crust of frost along the edges of the streams. Soon after, the air thickened with cold. Snow gathered in layers that softened the sound of every step, and the woods, once filled with the noise of birds and insects, shifted into a season of stillness. From December through March, this landscape transformed into a world defined by ice, slow winds, and silence. Life here moved according to a different rhythm. It was far from the towns and cities where lamps glowed through the night and where warm stoves hummed beneath wooden floors. In the forest, distance had a weight of its own. The nearest settlement might be a day or two away, sometimes more, and the routes leading back were often buried under snowdrifts taller than a man. The workers who lived in these camps knew that once winter closed in, the forest became both workplace and home, holding them in its quiet expanse for months at a time. The cold was not just a number on a scale, it inhabited everything. Temperatures dipped to -40 degrees, sometimes lower, a kind of cold that made the air feel dense and slow. Breath became visible the moment it left the lungs, forming soft clouds that lingered for several seconds before fading. Metal tools grew too cold to hold with bare hands. Even the bark of trees seemed to harden and tighten, as though the forest itself was bracing against the season. The wind moved through the pines in long, steady currents. It did not roar. It whispered across the branches, carrying small grains of ice that drifted like powdered glass. When the workers stepped outside in the mornings, the cold touched their faces immediately, a thin, sharp feeling that settled along the cheekbones and nose. After a while, they became accustomed to this sensation, but they never stopped respecting it. The forest in winter had its own boundaries, set by nature rather than people. Throughout the region, lumber camps rose among the trees. They were placed near water routes that would be used in spring when the logs were ready to travel downstream. Each camp was built before the snow grew too deep. Crews cleared the land, cut the base logs and shaped the structures using the same material that surrounded them. The buildings stood low and sturdy, designed to withstand the weight of snow and the steady pressure of freezing winds. Most important of all was the bunkhouse, the long wooden shelter where the men slept, ate, talked, and rested between long shifts in the woods. Outside the bunkhouse, the forest stretched in all directions. Tall white pines stood like quiet guardians, their trunks straight and pale in the muted daylight. Spruce and fir trees, coated in layers of frost, leaned slightly under the weight of accumulated snow. When the sun rose, it cast a soft blue glow across the ground. When it set, the forest darkened quickly, bringing with it a deeper silence, interrupted only by the gentle pop of distant branches contracting in the cold. The isolation of these camps shaped everyday life. Messages and goods from town took time to arrive. Newspapers were often weeks old by the time they reached the camps. Fresh food was rare. Most meals relied on supplies brought in bulk before winter began. Still, the workers understood these conditions. They accepted them with a quiet sense of routine, knowing that winter work demanded a steady pace, strong focus, and patience. Travel through the winter forest required careful movement. Snowshoes were commonly used to move between work areas or explore nearby creeks. Sleds, pulled by horses or oxen, carried equipment and food across the frozen ground. Trails formed gradually through daily motion. Over time, they became smooth corridors of compacted snow, connecting various parts of the camp and the surrounding woods. By evening, as the temperature dropped again, the trails hardened, making the walk back to the bunkhouse firm and steady. The forest's quietness was reassuring rather than eerie. Snow softened every sound, the distant chopping of an axe, the creak of wooden sled runners, the slow murmur of conversation. Even the animals seemed to move more gently in winter. Deer left narrow paths in the snow. Foxes appeared occasionally, trotting along the edges of clearings. Birds perched high in the trees, fluffing their feathers against the cold. Everything shared a common patience, waiting for spring but living calmly in the present season. For the workers, months passed according to simple cycles, waking, dressing, eating, working, returning, resting. They depended on their bunkhouse to shield them from the unforgiving climate. Outside, the cold dominated the landscape. Inside, warmth from the central stove provided a small but reliable refuge. The walls of the bunkhouse were thick, built from logs cut earlier in the season, each one fitted carefully to reduce drafts. The structure held heat well, though the chill lingered in the corners and along the floors. From the outside, the bunkhouse looked modest. Its roof sloped sharply to keep snow from accumulating too heavily. Smoke drifted steadily from the chimney, rising in a thin stream into the crisp air. A path cleared by boots and shovels led to the front door. The ground around the building remained firm and packed from daily foot traffic, a contrast to the untouched snow farther away. Within the camp, movement slowed as winter deepened. Days shortened, and the sun took longer to appear over the tree line. When it did, its light was pale and gentle, spreading across the forest like a thin wash of color. By mid-afternoon, shadows stretched long across the snow. The cold never lifted entirely, but eased slightly during midday, creating small windows of relief. The men who lived here grew used to these patterns. Their bodies adapted to the chill, their hands toughened from handling cold tools and rough wood. Their breath formed familiar clouds in front of them. What might have felt overwhelming at first gradually became routine. Winter shaped their days, but it did not consume their attention. They worked within it, learning its pace, respecting its strength, and settling into the quiet rhythm it created. The environment, though harsh, held a kind of beauty. The frozen rivers glistened under the sun. The trees stood tall and calm, forming long corridors of green and white. Snowdrifts shaped themselves naturally into smooth curves, untouched except for the faint tracks of animals. The sky varied between clear winter blue and soft grey, drifting back and forth with the weather. At night, the stars shone brightly, unhindered by smoke or city light. The forest felt vast and unhurried, stretching well beyond the reach of the camp. Throughout the season, the workers relied on each other. They lived close together, shared meals, and helped maintain the camp structures. Their routines required cooperation, gathering wood for the stove, checking the condition of the trails, clearing snow, adjusting tools. Everything was part of a shared effort to keep the camp functioning smoothly. These small tasks carried as much importance as the major ones. In the cold, consistency mattered more than speed. Even with the cold pressing against the walls, the bunkhouse gave them a sense of steadiness. It was a place where time passed predictably. Slow mornings, long days, quiet evenings. The steady crackle of the stove offered comfort. The soft rustle of blankets and clothing created familiar sounds. In the dim light of lanterns, conversations drifted at a gentle pace. Life unfolded quietly here, shaped not by urgency but by endurance and the calm of shared routine. In this landscape, winter was not an enemy. It was simply the environment in which they lived and worked, a season that asked for respect and rewarded those who moved patiently through it. The bunkhouse, standing firmly among the tall trees and endless snow, offered the one thing they needed most, a shelter that allowed them to face the forest each day with steady breath and warm hands. The day in the winter logging camp began long before the sun reached the edge of the horizon. In the deep stillness of early morning, when the sky remained the color of slate and the world outside the bunkhouse seemed suspended in a cold twilight, a single sound marked the beginning of everything. It was not loud in the way a bell rings across a town square. It was steady, metallic, and familiar, an iron triangle struck by a gloved hand. The tone carried through the length of the bunkhouse, brushing gently against the log walls, vibrating along the rafters, and sliding over the rows of narrow wooden bunks where more than 100 men rested under heavy blankets. It was 4:30 a.m. The sound did not ask for urgency. It simply signaled the transition between night and the slow unfolding of work ahead. The first movements were quiet. A few blankets shifted. Boots scraped softly against the wooden floor. The air inside the bunkhouse held both warmth and cold at once. Warm near the center, where the large iron stove kept a steady glow through the night, and sharply cold near the walls, where frost clung lightly to the window frames. When the men exhaled, their breath drifted upward in pale clouds, catching faint lantern light before dissolving into the dimness. Waking in this space was a ritual shaped by repetition. No one rushed. The day would be long, stretching from darkness into more darkness, and the best way to meet it was with patient preparation. Thick wool socks were pulled on. Underlayers of flannel and cotton were arranged neatly to seal warmth close to the skin. Then came the heavier garments, wool trousers, quilted shirts, thick jackets lined with coarse fabric, and scarves wrapped securely around the neck. The cold outside required layers that could hold heat for hours. Every item served a purpose. Clothing was not chosen for appearance, but for survival. There was one rule that everyone understood with steady clarity. Nothing, no sock, no glove, no collar, could be damp. Moisture in winter was unforgiving. Even a small patch of wet fabric could draw heat from the body faster than one might expect. Preparing for the day meant inspecting each layer by touch, ensuring dryness, warmth, and readiness. Hanging above the stove, a long line of clothing from the previous evening continued to dry. Mittens, scarves, and outer coats warmed slowly on the rope, turning gently as the heat rose. As more men sat up, the bunkhouse filled with a soft murmur of morning sounds. A kettle shifted on the stove, wooden bunks creaked with small motions, boots thudded lightly as they were pulled on and tightened. In the low light, figures moved carefully, still half wrapped in the drowsiness of the hour. Outside the walls, the forest remained silent, its branches heavy with snow, its trails untouched since the workers returned the day before. Breakfast came before daylight. A separate cookhouse, standing a short walk from the bunkhouse, held the warmth of early preparation. The cook had risen long before the bell, tending to the fire and setting pans on wide stoves. The door of the cookhouse opened and closed continually. As men stepped in from the cold, the shift of air carrying with it the sense of pancakes, fried salt pork, biscuits, and strong coffee. The warmth inside wrapped around them gently, settling into their clothing. Meals were taken without haste. They were part nourishment, part preparation for the hours ahead. Plates were filled generously, and the steady clatter of utensils created a simple rhythm beneath low voices. The coffee, dark and strong, provided a deep warmth that lingered long after the mug was set down. In the quiet light of lanterns, the men sat at long tables, shoulders close, sharing space in a calm, familiar way. Outside, the wind brushed the building gently, reminding them of the day waiting beyond the door. When breakfast ended, the workers stepped outside once more. The cold met them immediately, a full presence that settled along exposed skin. Snow crunched softly under boots. The sky remained dim, muted by a thin layer of morning clouds. The forest held its colour, deep greens and whites, softened by the faint glow of early light. Tools were collected, axes, crosscut saws, wedges and ropes. Horses waited nearby, their breath forming warm clouds that drifted slowly past their noses. The walk into the woods was not hurried. It was steady, following paths pressed by days of travel. Snowshoes hung on nearby posts for men who needed them, though many simply followed the beaten trails, where the ground was packed firm. As they walked, the camp faded behind them, replaced by the vast presence of the trees. The forest held a kind of quiet that was not empty but calm. Every sound, the crunch of snow, the jingle of harnesses, the muted snort of a horse, seemed softened by the winter air. When they reached the worksite, the day settled into its long rhythm. Trees stood tall and motionless, their trunks rising in straight, even lines. Sawdust from the previous days formed light patches against the snow, marking areas where lumber had already been cut. The tools were placed gently on the ground, and the work began in unhurried unison. The sound of a saw cutting through pine carried a slow, even tone. Axes struck with measured pace, not sharp or violent but steady, as if following a quiet internal rhythm. White chips of wood scattered onto the snow, creating small mounds that caught the morning light. Breath continued to rise in soft clouds, drifting upward and disappearing. The men moved with practiced ease, each understanding his role in the flow of the task. Hours passed gradually. The sun climbed only a little above the tree line, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The work continued uninterrupted, shaped by consistency rather than intensity. Horses pulled sleds loaded with logs along packed paths. Men guided them with calm gestures, speaking softly, so their voices would not carry too sharply across the cold air. The forest around them remained attentive, each branch heavy with frost. As midday approached, the cold softened slightly, enough to ease the stiffness in hands and shoulders. Lunch was simple, a small pause taken outdoors, near a sheltered area where the wind passed gently. Food brought from the camp was unwrapped and eaten quietly. Sometimes the workers stood, sometimes they leaned against logs, letting the moment stretch without expectation. Then the day resumed, moving forward with the same deliberate pace. By mid-afternoon, the light began to change. Winter days were short, and the sun's arc across the sky remained low. The shadows deepened, the temperature began its slow descent again. The men, recognizing the shift, prepared for the return walk. Tools were gathered, sleds repositioned, and paths cleared for the next day's work. The forest, in its stillness, seemed to receive these tasks with familiar acceptance. The walk back to camp held its own feeling of comfort. The bunkhouse, still faint in the distance, stood with a thin trail of smoke rising from its chimney. The lights inside, barely visible through frosted windows, hinted at warmth waiting within. As the men approached, the sound of snow underfoot changed subtly, becoming firmer near the entrance where the ground had been packed by constant use. Inside the bunkhouse, the warmth from the stove reached them gently. Gloves and coats were hung on the drying rope above the fire. Boots lined up along the wall, allowing the leather to soften in the heat. The room filled slowly with the layered scents of wood smoke, wool, and the faint sweetness of pine sap carried in on clothing. Some men sat quietly, stretching their hands toward the warmth. Others changed into lighter layers, easing their bodies into the comfort of the evening. The rhythm of the day moved into its final hours. Conversation flowed in soft tones, tools were checked and cleaned, a fiddle or harmonica might sound, its notes drifting through the air in slow, unhurried patterns. The bunkhouse, though filled with people, held a sense of spacious calm. The stove glowed steadily, casting a warm hue across the log walls. Dinner followed, offering another moment of comfort. The cookhouse glowed with lantern light as the workers stepped inside. Stew, bread, and hot drinks were served in simple bowls and cups. The meal was quiet, and the warmth of the food spread pleasantly through tired bodies. Outside, the forest darkened, and small flakes of snow began to fall. After dinner, the men returned to the bunkhouse. Some sat along the long bench by the wall, sharing stories in low voices. Others climbed into their bunks early, pulling heavy blankets over themselves. The air cooled gradually as the night deepened, though the stove continued its steady work. Frost gathered once more along the windows, forming soft white patterns that glistened in the lantern light. As the hours slipped by, the bunkhouse quieted. The rope above the stove held rows of drying gloves, scarves, and jackets, swaying slightly as warm air rose. The men rested, their breathing forming faint clouds in the dimness. Outside, the forest remained still, wrapped again in the patience of winter. The day had followed its familiar pattern, waking, preparing, eating, working, returning, resting. It was a rhythm shaped not by urgency, but by the steady demands of the season. Each morning would begin again at 4:30, with the soft ring of metal echoing through the bunkhouse, gradually moving the camp from the silence of night into the quiet movement of another winter day. In the winter logging camps, the body moved through each day as steadily as the tools it carried. The cold shaped everything, the pace of work, the number of layers worn, and even more importantly, the amount of food required to keep a person warm and capable through long hours in the forest. Energy was not a luxury here, it was a constant necessity, something renewed with every meal and slowly released through the steady rhythm of labor. The men in these camps consumed between 6,000 and 8,000 calories each day. The number was large, but in this environment it made sense. The cold pulled heat from the body with remarkable consistency. Muscles worked from before sunrise until after sunset. Snow weighed down boots, coats, and equipment. Every movement, lifting, pushing, carrying, cutting, demanded a steady supply of strength. The cookhouse became the quiet center of this routine nourishment. Long before the workers left their bunks, the cook had already lit the stoves, warmed the pans, and prepared the ingredients that would carry everyone through the day. The door opened to a wave of heat that contrasted with the cold outside. The scent of frying salt pork, freshly baked bread, and thick coffee drifted into the morning air. The light inside the cookhouse was dim but warm, glowing softly across rows of simple wooden tables. Breakfast was always generous. The plates carried food dense with energy. There were large stacks of pancakes, browned evenly on the stove's surface. There were slabs of salt pork, crisp around the edges. Sometimes there were biscuits or fried potatoes, and always there was coffee, dark, strong, and hot, poured into metal mugs that warmed the hands as much as the drink warmed the body. The men ate calmly, using the early hour to settle themselves before the long work ahead. The act of eating here was not hurried, but it was purposeful. Each bite held weight. In a city, such portions might feel excessive, but in the forest they were simply practical. The body needed warmth, and warmth came from calories. By the time the workers stepped back outside to begin their day, the food had already begun its quiet work, circulating energy, reinforcing muscles, and easing the shock of the cold that waited beyond the cookhouse walls. As the morning passed, the calories burned steadily. The tasks of winter logging did not involve quick, sudden motions, but long hours of movement. A saw worked through a trunk at a patient pace, back and forth, shaving thin curls of wood that fluttered to the snow below. An axe struck with deliberate repetition. Horses pulled sleds loaded with logs. Everything consumed strength, yet nothing rushed. Even when the men stood still for a moment, the cold continued its pull, drawing warmth away as if through invisible threads. The layers of wool and flannel helped, but the body still had to work harder than usual to maintain its core temperature. This constant internal effort, this quiet, unseen activity, burned nearly as much energy as the visible physical labor. By midday, the forest stillness softened. Light settled gently through the trees, forming muted patterns on the snow. The men paused for lunch, unwrapping food that had been prepared earlier. It was simple and steady: bread, cold meat, cheese, perhaps a piece of fruit brought from town before the winter deepened. Even outdoors, lunch served the same purpose as breakfast, to continue feeding the slow, enduring fire of warmth inside the body. Some ate standing, others found a log to sit on. Conversation remained light and unhurried. Steam rose softly from warm dishes carried in sealed containers. The woods around them held its calm, as if respecting the break in movement. In this moment, the energy taken in returned another layer of strength to the workers, allowing the day to continue without strain. As afternoon moved toward its quieter end, the cold began to rise again. Shadows stretched long across the snow. The temperature dipped and work became slightly heavier, not in effort, but in sensation. Gloves stiffened a little. Tools cooled more quickly. Each breath formed a thicker cloud. This was when the food consumed earlier proved its worth. The body, sustained by thousands of calories, remained warm at its core. Muscles stayed reliable, even as winter's strength increased. When the men finally walked back to the camp, the day's work resting behind them, the cookhouse prepared its second offering. Dinner was substantial, not extravagant, but carefully planned to replace every ounce of energy that had been used. Stews simmered slowly in large pots, absorbing the flavors of meat and vegetables. Bread warmed on racks near the stove. Sometimes beans were served, dense and satisfying. Hot drinks waited in deep kettles. The workers stepped inside, removing gloves stiff from the cold and brushing snow gently from their coats. The warmth of the cookhouse touched them immediately, settling into their bones. Dinner arrived in generous portions. Stew filled the bowls, thick and comforting. Meat provided strength, vegetables added grounding. Bread offered a slow, steady release of energy that would continue supporting the body into the night. The meal unfolded quietly. There was no rush, only a shared understanding that this was the moment to restore what the day had taken. The lanterns cast soft amber light across the tables. The steam from the stew rose in calm spirals. Outside, darkness settled deeper over the forest, and the bunkhouse glowed faintly across the clearing, waiting for the men to return. After dinner, there was still work for the food to do. The body, entering the slower rhythm of the evening, absorbed the last calories that would protect it through the night. Even sleep required warmth. With temperatures dropping sharply after sunset, the bunkhouse stove became the second half of the equation. Heat from fuel on the outside, heat from nourishment on the inside. Before resting, some of the workers ate small additional portions, a piece of bread, an apple saved from a previous delivery, or a small slice of salted meat. These final calories acted like a quiet guarantee that their bodies would remain steady through the coldest hours of darkness. As the men settled back into their bunks, wrapped in thick blankets, their breaths forming soft clouds that drifted above them, the day's meals continued their gradual, purposeful work. Energy stored from breakfast and dinner lingered, warming muscles, circulating through tired limbs, and supporting the slow, deep breathing of sleep. The body, even in rest, remained in conversation with the cold, responding with calm, measured heat, sustained entirely by the food taken in throughout the day. In this way, meals were not simply routines, they were the quiet framework of survival in the winter logging camps, an unseen partnership between nourishment, labor, and cold. Every plate, every cup, every bite carried the warmth needed to meet another day in the vast, patient forest. Before winter tightened its hold on the northern forests, the men who worked in the logging camps began their most essential task, preparing the ground on which they would spend the next several months. This work took place in late autumn, during the short window of time when the earth was still soft enough to shape, and the air, though cold, had not yet reached the relentless stillness of deep winter. The season had a quiet urgency to it, not rushed, but steady, as if the land and the workers moved in step with one another. The forest in late autumn carried a different mood from winter. The air was cool, filled with the smell of fallen leaves and damp soil. Pockets of mist lingered in shaded areas. The trees, many of them tall white pines, shifted slowly as light breezes passed through their branches. Underfoot, the ground remained pliable enough to work with, yet firm enough to support heavy loads. It was during this period that crews traveled into the woods to select the sites for the bunkhouse, cookhouse, stable, and tool sheds, the small cluster of structures that would hold life together through the coming freeze. Choosing the right location mattered. It needed to be close to the main stands of timber, but not so close that falling trees would pose a danger. It needed access to frozen waterways later in the season, because the logs would be hauled along those routes once the river drive began. And it needed enough flat, stable ground for the bunkhouse, which would shelter more than 100 men each night. Once a location was chosen, the clearing began. The forest floor was covered with branches, brush, and fallen logs. Workers moved through the space with axes and saws, removing the smaller trees first, then the larger ones, opening a wide area where the bunkhouse would stand. The sound of steel cutting through wood echoed gently between the trunks. Chips of bark scattered softly onto the soil. Horses, calm and accustomed to the task, dragged away what was cut, clearing the ground piece by piece. Stumps and roots presented the next challenge. These had to be removed before construction could begin. Men used long-handled tools, wedges, and ropes to pry them from the earth. The roots, thick and strong from years of growth, held tightly to the soil, but the workers moved with patience. They dug around the base, cut through the deeper roots, and loosened the earth until the stump shifted. With coordinated pulls from both men and horses, the stump lifted free, leaving a hollow patch of dark soil behind. Rocks were cleared in a similar manner. Some were small enough to lift by hand. Others were large and immovable, embedded deeply into the ground. These became part of the foundation plan. Large flat stones, weighing up to 135 kilograms, were pulled across the clearing using sleds and wooden rollers. Their weight made each movement slow and deliberate. The stones did not need to be placed deeply, just firmly enough on the prepared ground to support the logs that would become the bunkhouse walls. It was important to do this work before the earth froze. In winter, the soil would harden to a depth of 1 to 1.5 meters, becoming solid as stone. Digging into it would be nearly impossible. Preparing the foundation while the ground was still workable ensured that the bunkhouse would sit evenly and securely, resisting the shifts and pressures that winter brought. With the clearing complete and the stones in place, the next step was leveling the ground. The workers walked slowly across the site, using long wooden beams as guides. They filled low spots with packed soil and removed excess earth from higher areas. The goal was not perfection, but stability. Once the snow arrived, the ground would settle, and the logs of the bunkhouse would align naturally, as long as the base was even. Logs for construction had been cut earlier in the season from nearby stands of timber. These were carefully selected for their straightness and durability. Each log was trimmed, measured, and peeled to remove its outer bark. Removing the bark helped the walls resist moisture and allowed the logs to fit together more closely. The process of shaping them was slow and repetitive, producing a soft rhythm of scraping and chopping that blended into the sounds of the forest. When the ground was ready, the first row of logs was brought to the site. Horses helped move the heavy pieces, sliding them across the bare earth. The base logs were set directly onto the flat stones. Workers adjusted them by hand, ensuring each log rested securely along its length. This sill layer formed the foundation of the bunkhouse. It had to be strong enough to carry the weight of everything above it: the walls, the roof, the bunks, the stove, and the men who would gather inside. As the walls began to rise, the preparation of the site showed its importance. Logs fit neatly onto the stones. The structure remained level, even as more layers were added. The corners were joined with saddle notch cuts, carved carefully into the wood. These notches allowed the logs to interlock, creating a stable frame that could withstand wind, snow, and the constant shift of temperatures. Throughout this process, the workers continued preparing other parts of the camp. Nearby, a smaller clearing was made for the cookhouse. The kitchen needed its own space, separate from the sleeping quarters to reduce the risk of smoke buildup, and to keep the warmth of the cooking fire distinct from the heat of the bunkhouse stove. The stable, holding the horses that would pull sleds all winter, was also built early, ensuring that the animals had shelter from the cold. Tool sheds were constructed next. These were simple structures but essential. They protected saws, axes, ropes, and sled runners from snow and frost. Metal tools left outdoors would freeze and crack, and wooden handles would absorb moisture, making them brittle. Keeping tools dry ensured that work could continue smoothly through the coldest days. As autumn progressed, the air grew sharper. Frost appeared each morning, coating the ground in a thin layer of white. The days became shorter. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. Workers began to feel the subtle shift that marked the approach of winter. The pace of preparation did not quicken, but its importance grew. The buildings needed to be secure before the first heavy snow. Roof beams had to be in place. Walls needed to rise high enough to provide insulation. The central stove, still cold and unused, had to stand ready. Nothing in the process felt rushed. Each task followed the previous one with calm intention. The men moved through their work with the same steadiness that winter demanded of them. The forest, too, seemed to sense the change. The wind grew quieter. The colours faded into muted browns and deep greens. Birds flew less frequently. Even the horses exhaled thicker clouds of breath as they worked. By the time the first significant snowfall arrived, the camp had taken shape. The bunkhouse stood solidly on its stone base. The cookhouse was complete, with its stove installed and wood stacked neatly nearby. The stable held the horses in warm bedding. The tool sheds protected everything needed for the months ahead. Snow settled softly on the roofs, forming the first of many layers that would insulate the structures through winter. Inside the bunkhouse, the air still carried the chill of the season. The stove had not yet begun its nightly work of warming the room, but the place felt ready. The logs fit tightly together. The floor, smoothed and levelled, supported the rows of bunks. The windows held firm against the cold wind. The camp, once an open section of forest, had turned into a small, quiet settlement, prepared for the long stretch of winter days and nights that would soon surround it. And when winter finally arrived, quiet, deep, and complete, it found the camp waiting calmly, its buildings settled into the earth, its walls holding the promise of warmth, and its workers prepared for the steady rhythm of the season to come. Once the foundation stones had settled into the quiet earth and the first layer of logs rested securely upon them, the work of raising the walls began. This stage carried a steady rhythm, neither rushed nor slow, but moving at the pace the forest itself allowed. The men knew that each log they lifted, shaped, and set into place would stand between them and the deep cold of the northern winter. So the work unfolded with patience, with measured breaths, and with the calm understanding that shelter, once built with care, would serve faithfully through the long months ahead. The logs chosen for the walls came from the straightest white pines and spruces in the surrounding forest. Earlier in the season, workers had walked among the trees, marking those with minimal taper and strong, consistent grain. When the time came to build, these trees were ready, cut to length, peeled, and left to rest for a few days so the outer moisture could slip away. The bark, once removed, revealed pale wood beneath, smooth under the hand and cool to the touch. Even before shaping, the logs carried the scent of resin and clean sap, a quiet reminder of the forest that had provided them. Each log measured nearly 1/2 meter in diameter. Their size offered strength and insulation. Thick wood held warmth well, especially when layered carefully with materials that resisted wind. Men worked in pairs or small teams, guiding each log across the clearing with the help of horses or simple sleds. The weight of the timber made every movement deliberate. Nothing was hurried. When the logs reached the building site, they were rolled into position, turning slowly over the cold ground until they settled near the rising walls. The corners of the bunkhouse required the most attention. Here, the structure relied on saddle-notch joints, curved cuts carved into the underside of each log so it could rest securely atop the one beneath it. The notches needed to match the curvature of the log below almost perfectly. Too shallow, and the log would rock or shift. Too deep, and the strength of the timber would be compromised. Workers used axes, adzes, and small tracing tools to shape each notch. Chips of wood fell softly onto the ground, and the smell of fresh pine drifted into the cold air. Shaping a notch was a slow art. A worker started by marking the area that would be cut, tracing a line that followed the gentle arc of the log beneath. Then came the broad strokes, clean cuts with an axe to remove the bulk of the wood. After that, finer adjustments with the adze smoothed the interior curve. The process could take an hour or more per notch, depending on the size of the log and the condition of the wood. Each completed notch lowered one more log cleanly into place. When the weight of the log settled onto the one below, the structure tightened with a satisfying, quiet certainty. Course by course the walls rose. The men developed a quiet rhythm. Roll a log, measure it, mark the notch, cut it, shape it, lift it into place. Horses pulled, ropes tightened, men steadied the timber as it slid toward the wall. Once the log reached the height of the structure, workers guided it gently into the notch and tapped it with wooden mallets until it rested securely. Every movement was patient. Winter winds would soon test the strength of these walls, so nothing could be left uncertain. Though the logs were straight, small gaps formed naturally between them. Some were as thin as a finger, others a little wider. The spaces varied with the natural curve of each log and the subtle irregularities that no amount of shaping could fully erase. These gaps needed to be sealed long before winter arrived. Even a narrow opening could allow icy wind to blow through, carrying away precious heat and replacing it with cold that could settle deep into the bunkhouse during the night. To fill these gaps, the workers turned to materials supplied by the forest itself. The first layer of insulation came from sphagnum moss, gathered from damp areas nearby. The moss held warmth well and resisted decay, making it ideal for stuffing into long, narrow spaces. Men carried large bundles of it back to the construction site, where they tore it into manageable clumps and pressed it firmly into the gaps between the logs. The moss conformed to the shape of the wood, slipping into grooves and filling uneven edges. Over the moss came a second layer made from a mixture of clay, rich soil, chopped straw, and water. This chinking compound was thick and heavy. When applied, it clung to the wood and sealed the exterior surface of the wall. Workers spread it with flat wooden paddles, smoothing it into a consistent layer. As it dried, it hardened into a firm, wind-resistant barrier. The clay mixture helped block drafts, while the straw bound it together, preventing cracks from spreading as the logs expanded and contracted with changes in temperature. Some camps added a final layer of pine pitch to the exterior, especially on the wind-facing sides of the building. The pitch, warmed gently over a small fire, spread into a glossy, waterproof coating. When cooled, it formed a tough surface that kept moisture out and strengthened the chinking beneath. The scent of heated pine pitch drifted across the clearing while it was applied, a slow, resinous smell that lingered in the cold air. Not every camp had the time or resources to add this layer, but when they did, the walls benefited with improved durability throughout the winter. As the walls climbed past waist height, then chest height, the interior of the structure began to take shape. The logs formed long horizontal lines that outlined what would eventually become the sleeping quarters for more than 100 men. The space felt solid and sheltered even before the roof was added. Light filtered softly through the open top, falling across the pale wood and the earth floor below. Workers could already imagine the warmth that would gather here once the stove was lit and the winter settled in. By the time the walls reached a height of nearly 2.5 meters, the building appeared sturdy and complete, though much work remained. The logs fitted together snugly, with the weight of each layer pressing gently onto the one beneath it. With every additional row, the structure gained strength, anchoring itself more firmly against the coming storms. The bunkhouse felt like part of the forest, built from its trees, shaped by its materials, and standing quietly in harmony with the land that surrounded it. Wind was the greatest enemy of all structures in the North Woods. In open spaces, it moved freely, carrying the sharp cold that could steal warmth from a room in minutes. The men checked the chinking repeatedly as they worked. Even a small oversight could allow a narrow stream of cold air to slip inside. One draft could chill an entire section of the bunkhouse during the night. So workers inspected the walls from both inside and outside, pressing moss deeper where needed, smoothing clay more evenly, and sealing any place where light or air passed through. The forest offered moments of quiet as the men worked. Occasionally, the wind rustled the branches overhead, or a distant bird called across the trees. But most of the time, the clearing remained calm, filled only with the sounds of tools against wood, low voices sharing instructions, and the soft shift of logs as they settled into place. The work felt grounded, steady, and unhurried, a slow shaping of a space that would soon offer shelter from the bitter cold. When the final courses of logs were added and the walls reached their full height, the structure looked complete. The surfaces felt smooth where they needed to be, rough where it helped grip the clay. The chinking held firmly, creating clean lines that filled the gaps between each log. The bunkhouse stood strong, ready for the roof that would soon protect it from snow and wind. By the end of this stage, the men stepped back to admire their work. The rising walls formed a quiet boundary against the forest, creating a sense of security even before the roof beams were lifted into place. With each layer of log and each sealed gap, the bunkhouse became more than wood and clay. It became the heart of the winter camp, shaped by patient hands and steady effort, prepared to hold warmth through nights that would soon grow long and cold. And as the sun lowered behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, the walls stood in calm silence, strong, insulated, and ready for the winter winds that would test every notch, every seam, and every thoughtful detail. When the log walls reached their full height and the bunkhouse stood firmly against the quiet clearing, the next task rose naturally from the work already completed, shaping the roof that would protect everything beneath it. Winter in the northern forests brought snow not as a light covering, but as a steady presence, falling quietly for days and settling in deep layers that grew heavier as the season progressed. The roof needed to accept this weight without strain, letting the snow rest where it must and guiding it away when the load became too much. Building such a roof was a slow, deliberate craft, shaped by experience and by the simple logic of nature. The first step was placing the main roof beams. These beams were thick, straight logs chosen with care from strong timber. Each beam spanned the width of the bunkhouse, resting on the topmost log courses. The workers lifted them one by one, guiding them into place as the horses helped pull from the ground. The beams landed gently on the wall tops, settling into shallow notches that had been cut to hold them steady. Spaced a few meters apart, they formed the backbone of the entire roof system, a quiet grid of strength that reached from one side of the bunkhouse to the other. Because the winters were long and heavy, the beams had to carry not just the roof's weight, but the weight of snow that would accumulate slowly over weeks. The spacing between them balanced two needs: enough distance to allow the roof to breathe, yet close enough that no section sagged under pressure. Once the beams were aligned, the workers walked along them with careful steps, checking their level. Even a slight tilt could shift the snow unevenly, so they adjusted the supports, tapping each beam gently until the balance felt right. With the beams secured, the rafters came next. These were smaller, narrower logs or hewn boards placed at an angle, creating a sloped shape that guided snow toward the edges of the roof. The slope was important. A roof too flat would allow snow to pile endlessly until the weight pressed dangerously downward. A roof too steep would shed snow too quickly, leaving the upper logs exposed to frost. The chosen angle reflected generations of quiet trial and error, something between the two extremes, a gentle descent that let snow accumulate just enough to serve as natural insulation without overburdening the structure. Once the rafters were aligned, the frame of the roof took form. From a distance, it resembled the ribbed outline of some great wooden shell, resting quietly above the log walls. Inside the bunkhouse, the rafters cast soft lines of shadow along the upper beams, hinting at the sense of enclosure that would deepen once the roof was finished. As the workers moved along the structure, the forest around them remained steady, and the cold air held the faint scent of sap and fresh-cut pine. The next layer was the sheathing. In many camps, the workers used wide wooden planks laid across the rafters, fitted tightly to keep snow and moisture from entering. But in the deep forests where resources varied, builders often turned to birch bark, one of the most resilient natural materials available. Birch bark had remarkable qualities. It resisted water, shed moisture easily, and remained flexible even in low temperatures. When layered in sheets, it formed a weatherproof barrier that protected the roof from melting snow and freezing rain. Gathering birch bark was a careful process. Workers removed the outer layers in broad, smooth sections during the warmer months, allowing the inner bark to remain so the trees continued to grow. The bark was then stored in dry sheds until construction time, when it was unrolled, flattened, and laid over the roof frame. Each sheet overlapped the one below it, just as shingles would on a modern roof, creating a pattern that guided water downward. As the bark settled into place, its pale surface caught the soft autumn light, giving the roof a muted brightness that contrasted with the darker logs below. Over the birch bark came the sod. This layer gave the roof both weight and warmth. Sod was cut from nearby clearings in rectangular slabs, earth, roots, and grass bound together in a thick mat. These pieces, when lifted, held firmly without breaking thanks to the dense weave of roots beneath the soil. Workers carried the sod sections to the roof, lifting them carefully with ropes and placing them along the sloped surface. Each slab pressed gently against the birch bark, settling into place with reassuring solidity. The sod layer served several purposes. Its weight kept the birch bark from shifting during winter storms. Its mass held warmth inside the bunkhouse, acting as a natural insulating blanket. And its earthy surface blended the structure with the surrounding forest, giving it a quiet, grounded presence against the snow. When rain or snow fell, the sod absorbed only what it needed, letting the rest drain slowly downward, following the sloped path created by the rafters. As the workers arranged the sod, they pressed the edges together, creating an even blanket across the roof. Roots intertwined, soil settled, and the surface took on a soft, natural texture that changed gently with the weather. On dry days, the sod appeared muted brown or dull green. When snow arrived, it covered the roof in a clean, unbroken layer that glowed faintly in the winter light. The weight of the snow added insulation, holding heat inside the bunkhouse more effectively than almost any man-made material available at the time. The snow itself became a partner in the construction. In deep winter, when storms rolled through the forest and heavy flakes accumulated hour after hour, the snow layered itself quietly across the roof. Instead of threatening the structure, it settled into the sod, compressing slowly and forming a dense shield that kept the interior warm. The roof beams, rafters, birch bark, sod, and snow all worked together, forming a protective system shaped by both human hands and the season itself. Inside the bunkhouse, the roof created a sense of enclosure that was steady and reassuring. The interior rafters arched gently overhead, visible between the long beams. Light from the central stove flickered upward, casting soft patterns along the wooden ceiling. The smell of birch, pine, and earth lingered faintly in the air, especially on cold nights when the temperature outside dropped sharply. As the stove warmed the room, heat rose and collected beneath the roof, held there by the layers of sod and the growing blanket of snow above. From outside, the finished roof looked simple, just a long, sloping surface rising from the log walls. But every element had been shaped with purpose. The angle of the slope, the strength of the beams, the careful placement of the birch bark, the weight of the sod, and the natural accumulation of snow all played quiet roles in the winter ahead. Through storms, winds, and long stretches of cold, the roof did what it was meant to do: remain still, absorb the season, and guard the people sleeping below. As the final touches were made, the workers stepped back to observe their work. The bunkhouse now resembled a small, grounded shelter, calm against the backdrop of tall pines. The roof, packed and layered, seemed almost like a part of the forest floor, lifted gently and placed above the walls. It carried the muted colors of the earth, blending naturally with the winter landscape. By the time snow began to fall consistently, the roof was ready. Flakes landed softly on the sod, disappearing into its texture. Day after day, the snow deepened, forming a thick, even layer that settled into every contour of the roof. It stayed there, unmoving except in the gentlest breezes, providing a quiet, dependable warmth to those inside. And through the long months of winter, through the hush of early mornings, the steady rhythm of work, the stillness of nights, the roof remained above them, patient and strong, holding back the cold and offering shelter in the calm way that only well-built structures can. It was the final touch of preparation, the element that completed the bunkhouse, and the silent partner that carried the weight of the season without complaint. Inside the bunkhouse, the world moved at a softer pace. The noise of construction, the sharp scent of freshly cut wood, and the distant murmur of the forest gave way to a quieter atmosphere once the roof had settled into place. What remained was the task of shaping the interior, a space that would hold more than 100 men through long nights of winter and provide the steady comfort needed after hours of labor in the cold. The floor came first. In many camps, the builders used the earth itself as the foundation. After clearing the site, they packed the soil firmly, pressing it down with wooden tampers until it formed a smooth, dense surface. This packed earth floor had a muted warmth, absorbing heat from the central stove and releasing it slowly. When walked upon, it gave slightly under the weight of boots, creating a soft, familiar sound that blended easily with the natural silence of the room. In more prosperous camps, or those with additional time, a wooden floor was added. Workers laid planks across simple joists, fitting them together until they formed a clean, level surface. The wood, often pine or spruce, carried a pale color and a faint, resinous scent that deepened as the indoor warmth spread across it. Wooden floors stayed drier than earth, and they made sweeping easier during the season, especially when snow and dirt were tracked inside at the end of each day. Regardless of the material, the floor was kept simple. This space was not meant for decoration, but for durability. Every step, every drop of melting snow, every shift of boots and blankets required a surface that would hold steady through months of use. Once the floor was finished, the room took on a more complete shape, grounding the space and preparing it for the bunks that would line the walls. The bunks defined the interior. Built as sturdy wooden frames, they were arranged in long rows along both sides of the bunkhouse. Most were double-tiered, with an upper and lower level. The lower bunks sat close to the warmth of the stove when the fire was lit, while the upper bunks rose into pockets of slightly cooler air. Each bunk measured just enough for a single person, long enough to stretch out, wide enough to hold blankets, and a few personal belongings. The sound of constructing the bunks echoed gently through the unfinished room. Workers measured the frames, cut boards to length, and fitted crosspieces into place. Mallets tapped softly against wood. Sawdust drifted to the floor in thin, pale curls. As each section was completed and set along the wall, the space became more defined. The room grew narrower in appearance, not through crowding, but through the gradual formation of rows that guided movement into a central passage. When all the bunks were completed, more than 100 sleeping spaces lined the interior. They created a sense of order, simple, linear, and clear. Each bunk, though small, offered a place of rest after long days in the forest. Blankets made of wool or heavy fabric waited to be placed on them once the men moved in. Above some bunks, small shelves or hooks were added, providing a place to hang gloves, scarves, or a lantern during the early evenings before sleep. Between the two walls of bunks ran a narrow walkway. This central path stretched the entire length of the bunkhouse, forming the corridor through which all movement flowed. In the early mornings and late evenings, boots crossed it in soft, steady lines. The walkways served as the main artery of the building, a simple space without ornament, but crucial for allowing men to move between their bunks, the door, and the stove. Even when every bunk was filled, the walkway remained open, offering clear passage through the otherwise crowded room. At the heart of the interior stood the iron stove. Its shape was long and rectangular, extending through the center of the bunkhouse like a silent spine of warmth. The stove's surface was dark and smooth, marked only by the small door where wood was fed into the fire. Above it, the stovepipe rose toward the ceiling, traveling horizontally for several meters before turning upward and exiting through the roof. This long, horizontal pipe allowed heat to spread across the room before drifting out into the cold air outside. When the stove was lit, warmth radiated outward in gentle waves. The air near the stove grew soft and golden with heat, while the corners of the room stayed cool, holding the quiet of winter even inside the structure. The difference between these pockets of air created natural places within the bunkhouse, spots where men preferred to sit, others where they stored their boots, and others where they rested after dinner. But even in the coolest corners, the temperature remained bearable once the stove had burned long enough. Along the walls between bunks, small shelves held lanterns and dry supplies. Rows of pegs were driven into the logs, ready to hold coats, scarves, and wet mittens at the end of each day. Above the stove, a long drying line stretched across the room. Beneath the roof beams, the line hung quietly, holding gloves, socks, and outer layers that needed to dry overnight. As the fire warmed the room, steam rose from the wet cloth, drifting upward into the dim light before disappearing. The atmosphere inside the bunkhouse was shaped by the interplay of these simple elements. The dense floor, the long rows of bunks, the narrow walkway, and the steady presence of the stove. During the day, the interior remained mostly empty, holding the quiet of absence as the workers spent their hours in the forest. But in the evenings, when boots thudded gently across the floor and low voices filled the space, the room took on a gentle sense of life. The ceiling, supported by the rafters set earlier, sloped slightly to match the shape of the roof. Snow resting above muffled outside sounds even further, creating a soft hush that settled into the room. Lanterns hung at intervals along the beams, their light spreading in warm, dim patterns across the walls. The logs, darkened slightly by sap and age, reflected a muted glow that made the interior feel calm and grounded. Nothing inside the bunkhouse was extravagant. The materials were simple, the design straightforward, and the layout built for utility rather than comfort. Yet as winter deepened and temperatures fell, the interior became a refuge. The men returned each evening knowing there would be warmth, a place to sit, a bunk to lie in, and the companionship of others sharing the same quiet rhythm of work and rest. Through the coldest nights, when the forest outside grew still beneath the weight of snow and the wind brushed softly against the log walls, the bunkhouse held its warmth. The stove glowed steadily. Blankets rustled softly as tired bodies settled into their bunks. The walkway remained clear, a narrow path connecting one end of the room to the other. And the interior, shaped from the simplest materials, became the quiet heart of the camp, steady, grounded, and prepared for every winter morning still to come. At the center of the bunkhouse stood an object that shaped every hour of winter life, the long iron stove. Though simple in appearance, it was the quiet anchor of the entire building, the source of warmth that allowed the workers to sleep, dry their clothes, and rise each morning ready for the day ahead. Without it, the cold of the northern forest would seep into every corner of the structure, settling into the bunks and lingering through the night. But with it, the room held a steady, gentle heat that softened the sharp edge of winter. The stove itself stretched a little over a meter in length, about 1.2 meters long and nearly a meter wide. Made of dark, heavy cast iron, it rested on short legs that lifted it slightly from the floor. Its weight gave it a grounded presence, as though it had grown from the earth beneath the bunkhouse rather than being carried in. The surface of the stove was smooth and cool to the touch when the fire inside died down, but under full heat it glowed faintly, radiating warmth that reached every part of the room in slow, even waves. Above the stove, a stovepipe extended horizontally before curving upward toward the roof. This design was deliberate. The long pipe, running nearly the full length of the bunkhouse before rising, allowed heat to travel through the room rather than escaping directly outside. The pipe warmed gradually, becoming another quiet source of heat. Even when the main stove was burning strongly, the stovepipe added an additional layer of warmth, helping maintain a steady temperature across the large room. The heat it produced was softer than the fire's direct glow, more like the warmth of sunlight filtered through clouds, gentle and constant. Throughout the winter, the stove burned almost continuously. It was tended with careful routine, never left to weaken for long. Each evening, after the workers returned from the forest and the cookhouse lights dimmed, the stove became the final task of the day. The fire was stoked with dry wood, pine, spruce, or cedar, whichever had been prepared earlier. The flames settled into the logs, cracking softly as they grew, sending steady ripples of heat outward. The room warmed gradually, beginning near the stove and spreading to the farthest bunks. One person carried the responsibility of watching the fire through the night, the chore boy. Usually 16 or 17 years old, he was the youngest member of the camp. His tasks were simple in appearance but held deep importance. He swept the floors, carried water, delivered messages, and tended to the stove. During the day, he moved through the bunkhouse and cookhouse with quiet steps, helping wherever needed. But at night, his responsibility became singular. Keep the fire alive. The chore boy slept lightly, if at all, in a bunk placed close to the stove. It was not the warmest spot, those were the bunks built nearest the stove's center, but it was close enough for him to wake when the fire dipped, and far enough to avoid the full heat that might make rest difficult. Every few hours he rose, added wood, adjusted the coals, and made sure the flames held their strength. The sound of him moving, boots touching the wooden floor, the stove door opening with a soft creak, became part of the natural rhythm of the night. The importance of this task could not be overstated. If the fire went out for even a few hours during the coldest nights of winter, the temperature inside the bunkhouse could drop rapidly. The walls held back the wind, and the layers of chinking insulated the structure well, but nothing inside the bunkhouse produced warmth except the stove. Without it, the room would cool to match the forest outside. In mild conditions, the men might simply wake to discomfort. But in the heart of winter, when the temperature fell to -30 or lower, the cold could settle quickly and dangerously. So the chore boy worked with quiet precision, rising before the fire weakened, feeding it enough to maintain its strength, yet not so much that it roared. A balanced flame was the goal, steady, deep, and long-lasting. He learned to read the fire's behavior, noticing how the wood shifted as it burned, listening for the subtle difference between healthy crackling and the softer sound of dying embers. The stove gave signals to those who paid attention, and the boy, over time, became skilled in interpreting them. Around the stove, an essential routine took place every evening: drying clothing. Winter work meant snow clinging to wool jackets, ice settling into scarves, and moisture accumulating along the edges of mittens and gloves. Returning to the bunkhouse, the workers removed these damp layers and hung them carefully on the long drying line strung above the stove. The line, made of durable rope, stretched from one roof beam to another, holding dozens of garments at once. As the stove warmed the room, steam rose from the drying clothes, drifting upward before disappearing into the dimly lit rafters. The area immediately around the stove became a quiet gathering place in the evenings. Not a place for conversations or activity, those happened mostly on the outer bunks or near the doorway, but a place of stillness where men sat to warm their hands, rest their feet, or simply enjoy the feeling of heat radiating through the air. They sat on wooden benches or on the edge of lower bunks, letting the warmth settle into their muscles after a long, cold day in the forest. The glow from the stove created a soft circle of light on the floor, a muted orange patch that flickered gently as the fire shifted. The temperature in the bunkhouse varied according to distance from the stove. Near the center, it was warm, sometimes even hot when the fire was strong and the pipe radiated heat. Toward the walls, the air became cooler, though never cold enough to be uncomfortable once the stove had burned for several hours. The men learned these gradients over time. Some preferred the warm bunks closer to the stove, while others chose the cooler corners, where the night air stayed crisp. Each spot offered its own kind of comfort, shaped by personal habit and the natural flow of heat. The stove not only warmed the room, but also created subtle currents of air. As the fire burned, warm air rose from the stove's surface, lifting gently toward the ceiling. Cooler air drifted downward along the walls and moved toward the stove, completing a quiet circular pattern. This airflow helped distribute warmth evenly, ensuring that even the farthest bunks felt the stove's presence. The movement was slow and almost imperceptible, but over the course of hours, it became the invisible mechanism that kept the room livable through the season. Maintaining the stove required a steady supply of firewood. Each afternoon, before the sun dipped below the trees, workers or chore boys brought in stacks of split logs from the woodpile outside. These logs were arranged neatly beside the stove or along the inner walls, ready for use through the night. The woodpile had its own rhythm, growing steadily through autumn, shrinking gradually through winter, then replenished again when the seasons turned. Splitting wood for the stove was an essential task, performed with the same calm discipline that shaped every part of camp life. Even with the stove radiating warmth, the bunkhouse never became overly hot. The logs of the walls absorbed excess heat and released it slowly. The sod-covered roof held warmth in winter, but prevented the interior from overheating. And the steady draft of the stovepipe maintained a gentle airflow, allowing the fire to burn cleanly without filling the room with smoke. Workers often remarked not on the heat itself, but on its consistency, a stable, quiet warmth that endured through the deepest cold. In the early morning hours, long before the bell rang to wake the camp, the fire reached its lowest point. The chore boy rose once again, adding wood, adjusting the damper, and gently stirring the embers until the flames grew. This moment, often unnoticed by the sleeping workers, kept the bunkhouse steady. Outside, the forest lay frozen beneath a sky still heavy with night. But inside, warmth gathered again, preparing the room for the slow stirring of bodies rising from their bunks. By the time dawn crept into the forest, touching the tops of the trees with pale light, the stove had already given the bunkhouse several hours of renewed heat. The drying line sagged slightly under the weight of clothing now warm and ready for the day. The iron surface glowed softly, and the workers, stepping from their bunks, felt the familiar comfort of the stove's presence. Through every night of winter, through storms and clear skies alike, the central stove held its place, quiet, steady, enduring. It was more than a piece of equipment. It was the gentle core of the bunkhouse, the silent companion to every hour of rest, and the reason the camp could withstand the long season that enveloped the forest in cold and snow. As the long winter day moved toward its end, a different kind of stillness settled over the logging camp. The sounds of saws, axes, and sled runners faded gradually as the men walked back toward the bunkhouse, leaving the forest to its natural quiet. Snow clung softly to their boots and clothing, and their movements carried the slow heaviness that comes after many hours of steady work. By the time the sky began to dim, the camp shifted into its evening rhythm, a routine shaped by warmth, rest, and the simple comfort of being indoors after a day spent in the cold. Stepping into the bunkhouse always brought a subtle change in sensation. The cold that surrounded the building loosened the moment the door swung open. Inside, layers of warmth gathered in the air, rising gently from the iron stove that glowed in the center of the room. The first breath taken inside the bunkhouse was always different from the ones outside. It carried the scent of burning pine, the faint tang of drying wool, and the familiar mix of sweat and cold air that drifted from the workers' clothing. During winter, dampness clung to nearly everything the men wore. Snow that had melted on their coats during the walk back from the forest cooled again once indoors, creating a soft, heavy smell, one that combined the sweetness of wool with the faint mineral scent of ice. As the stove warmed the air, this mixture deepened, spreading through the space with calm familiarity. The smell never became overwhelming, because the air inside the bunkhouse circulated slowly, rising through the warm pockets around the stove and settling into cooler places near the walls. Over time, the scent of the room became part of the camp's identity, a gentle reminder of the day's labor and the warmth waiting at night. The stove created two climates within the bunkhouse. Near its center, the air felt soft and warm, rolling outward in slow waves that wrapped gently around the nearest bunks. Here, the temperature held steady through most of the night, offering a comfortable space for those who preferred the warmth. As one moved farther from the stove, the heat diminished gradually. The bunks near the walls remained cooler, sometimes even chilly, when the wind outside pushed softly against the logs. Some men preferred these cooler places. They found comfort in the contrast, the feeling of a brisk, crisp pocket of air under their blankets, balanced by the steady warmth that drifted from the center of the room. Choosing a sleeping spot became a quiet practice shaped by habit. Those who enjoyed the stronger heat often chose the bunks nearer the stove, where the firelight flickered faintly across the wooden frames. Those who preferred the cooler air chose the bunks along the outer edges, where the warmth arrived gently and slowly. The chore boy, whose responsibility it was to tend the fire through the night, slept close enough to monitor the stove, but far enough not to be overwhelmed by the heat. Each man found a place that suited him, and over the course of the winter, the pattern remained constant, forming a quiet map of preferences across the room. Once the men changed out of their damp outer layers and hung them above the stove to dry, the evening settled into its unhurried rhythm. Tools used throughout the day were inspected with patient attention. Axes were wiped clean of sap and frost, saw blades were checked for dull spots, and small whetstones were used to sharpen them. Handles were oiled gently, restoring the smoothness of the wood. This quiet evening, maintenance ensured that the tools would be ready for the next day's work, but it also provided a calm moment for the men, a chance to sit, breathe, and reflect without speaking. While some worked on their tools, others played simple games of cards or dominoes. The men gathered at small makeshift tables or sat cross-legged on the floor, dealing cards with movements that carried no urgency. The games were not competitive. They were simply a way to fill the quiet hours before sleep. The soft sounds of cards sliding against wood blended with the steady breathing of men resting on their bunks. Laughter, when it appeared, was low and brief, never disturbing the restful tone of the room. Conversations drifted in gentle streams, touching on small observations about the day or the weather outside. A few men brought instruments into the bunkhouse. These were often modest, a harmonica, a small fiddle, or a handmade jaw harp carved from scrap metal. The music they played was simple, steady, and unadorned. A single fiddle tune might last several minutes, repeating softly without ever rising in intensity. The harmonica's low notes moved through the room like slow breaths, rising into the warm air before fading into the rafters. Music did not interrupt the quiet. It merged with it, adding a soft thread to the overall atmosphere. In one section of the bunkhouse, near the far end of the room, stood a wooden bench known as the deacon's seat. It was not a place of authority, nor did it carry any religious significance. It was simply a bench where men sat when they wanted to share stories or pass along bits of experience that might help others. The deacon's seat became a place of gentle instruction, a place where older loggers explained how to spot weak timber, how to recognize early signs of frostbite, or how to move safely across icy trails. These conversations were calm and slow, never lecturing, always offered in a voice softened by years in the forest. Younger workers often gathered nearby, listening quietly, not because they were told to listen, but because the bench held a kind of practical wisdom. The stories shared there were not dramatic tales or heroic moments. They were small observations shaped by cold mornings, heavy logs, and long experience. A man might explain how to keep mittens dry in blowing snow, or how to adjust clothing layers so that sweat did not freeze during long hours of labor. Another might describe how to recognize changes in the wind, how to read the shapes of clouds, or how to choose a safe path when the snow was deep and heavy. The bench was also a place for companionship. Some men sat there simply to rest, leaning against the wall with hands folded in their laps, watching the room while the fire softened the shadows. They spoke gently, if at all, offering simple reflections or quiet observations about the camp. The deacon seat, over time, became a symbol of the camp's steady life, a reminder that even in the harshest winters, there was room for patience, sharing, and calmer forms of connection. The smells of the evening deepened as the stove warmed the room. Wool dried slowly above the fire, releasing the soft, earthy scent of wet fabric. Boots placed near the edges of the stove opened slightly as the leather softened, filling the air with a faint but familiar smell. Pine smoke drifted upward from the stove's vent, carrying the resinous scent of the forest floor. The combination of wool, smoke, and warmth created a scent that belonged uniquely to winter logging camps, a quiet blend that held both the labor of the day and the comfort of the night. As the men settled into their bunks, the room entered its final rhythm of the day. The lanterns hanging from the rafters flickered with gentle, steady light. Shadows moved along the walls in soft shapes, swaying slightly as the fire shifted. The sound of pages turning from a small number of books moved through the air like distant rustling. Some men wrote brief notes in small journals, recording the weather or simple thoughts that helped mark the passing days. Others lay back on their bunks, hands folded behind their heads, letting the warmth ease into their limbs. The drying line above the stove held layers of clothing that swayed slightly as the warm air rose. Steam drifted upward, fading into the darkness above. In the cooler corners of the room, blankets rustled as men settled in, adjusting their layers until warmth gathered beneath the fabric. The rhythm of breathing deepened, forming a quiet chorus that filled the space, blending with the faint crackling of wood inside the stove. Over time, the bunkhouse grew still. The few voices that remained softened into low tones. Cards were stacked, tools stored, boots arranged neatly by the bunks. The stove continued its steady work, sending warmth outward, inch by inch. Outside, the forest stood silent beneath the weight of snow, holding a night that moved at its own patient pace. The logs of the bunkhouse insulated the room from the cold winds, and the sod roof held the heat carefully, preventing it from slipping into the dark sky. Near the center of the bunkhouse, the chore boy watched the stove one last time before resting. He placed a final log inside, ensuring the fire would burn long enough before he needed to rise again. Then he sat quietly on the edge of his bunk, listening to the room settle. The warmth wrapped around him gently, carrying the scents of pine and wool. When he lay down, he closed his eyes easily, comforted by the knowledge that the stove would continue its slow, steady work. As midnight approached, the bunkhouse remained calm, the air holding its warmth like a deep, steady breath. A faint glow radiated from the stove's iron surface, casting a quiet pool of orange light across the floor. The wind outside brushed gently against the roof, but inside, nothing stirred. The camp had entered its nightly state of stillness, a long, quiet moment, suspended between the labor of one day and the labor of the next. Through the hours of darkness, the bunkhouse stayed warm, the room filled with the slow breathing of resting men, the steady crackle of fire, and the lingering scent of wool, smoke, and pine. It was the nightly life of the camp, simple and grounded, shaped not by noise or activity, but by the calm presence of warmth, routine, and shared rest. In the deep winter of the northern forests, the men who lived and worked in the logging camps relied on more than strength alone. The cold, steady, and unchanging shaped the rhythm of every day, and to move through it safely required a quiet understanding of the body, the snow, and the subtle signs offered by the environment. Over time, each worker gathered a collection of simple, reliable skills, small techniques passed from older loggers to younger ones, shared in soft conversation during the evenings or learned through slow observation of how the forest responded to winter. The first and most essential of these skills was recognizing the early signs of cold injury. Frostbite did not arrive suddenly. It appeared in gradual moments, slipping in quietly, when a glove became damp, or when a strong gust of wind pressed too long against exposed skin. Men learned to watch for the subtle shift in color that signaled danger, a patch of skin turning pale, then losing its warmth, moving toward a dull, white or faint gray. Fingers, cheeks, ears, and toes were the most vulnerable places. When these areas changed color, the cold had already begun its slow work. In the stillness of winter, catching these signs early was one of the most dependable acts of protection. The men grew familiar with the sensation that preceded frostbite, a tingling that faded into numbness. It was not painful, but rather a soft dullness, as though the cold were gently brushing the area and asking it to go quiet. Whenever they felt this, they stopped what they were doing and pressed the affected skin against warm layers of clothing or cupped it between their gloved hands. They did this calmly and without alarm. In the forest, such small moments of prevention made the difference between a day that continued in steady motion and one that became difficult. For mild frostbite or the first sign of chilled skin, the men used a simple, practical method: snow. Clean, loose snow, gathered from the surface, was rubbed gently over the pale area. The coldness of the snow might seem contradictory, but the purpose was to warm the skin slowly by bringing it back toward a temperature that matched the air around it. Sudden heat could cause further injury, but snow melted gradually, allowing blood to return to the skin in a controlled way. The workers did this with care, never rushing, and only in cases where the cold had not progressed too far. They knew that deeper frostbite required more warmth and more time. Beyond recognizing frostbite, loggers learned to conserve heat in their fingers and toes during the long hours outside. Winter in the forest required constant attention to circulation. Gloves and socks needed to remain dry because even a small trace of moisture could pull warmth away from the body. When snow melted on gloves, the men brushed it off immediately. When boots felt damp, they added dry straw or wool scraps inside to absorb moisture until they could return to the bunkhouse and place them near the stove. To protect their hands, workers used a simple technique that others rarely noticed. As they walked or paused between tasks, they curled their fingers gently inside their gloves, forming a loose fist that reduced heat loss. This small movement helped keep blood circulating, allowing their fingertips to remain warm even during long stretches of stillness. For their feet, they relied on the slow, patient method of stomping the snow. It was not a forceful motion, just a quiet pressing of the feet into the ground to encourage circulation. Each man found his own rhythm, a soft thud repeated every few minutes that kept the cold from settling into the toes. The layer closest to the skin mattered just as much. Thin wool socks worn beneath thicker ones helped wick moisture away. The men understood this instinctively, changing socks midday if needed, and placing damp pairs near the stove each evening. They treated their clothing not as accessories, but as tools, simple, essential instruments that helped maintain warmth through snow and wind. But winter survival was not only about individual techniques. it depended just as strongly on the collective. The men who worked in the forest learned quickly that no one endured the season alone. The cold taught them a shared sense of awareness, an understanding that each person's safety contributed to the well-being of the entire camp. This awareness did not express itself loudly. It showed up in small, steady actions. When a man worked too long without moving, another would offer a brief reminder to flex his hands or check his cheeks. When someone's coat looked damp from melting snow, a quiet suggestion was made to step aside and brush it off near a sheltered area. If a worker seemed slower than usual, others watched him subtly, noting whether he was simply tired or beginning to feel the cold more deeply. They acted without fanfare, without drawing attention, just gentle, practical gestures that helped everyone move safely through the day. These habits extended into the evenings. Near the stove, as clothing dried and the room filled with warm air, men observed each other for signs of deeper chill. A quiet remark might be made. "Your gloves are still damp on the inside, turn them around," or "Move this closer to the stove, the fabric has not warmed fully." Such comments carried no urgency. They were simply the natural rhythm of the bunkhouse, shaped by years of shared winters. During storms, when visibility dropped and snow drifted high, along the paths, the men stayed close to one another as they moved between the bunkhouse and the cookhouse. No one walked alone during these times. The snow changed the shape of the land, creating soft ridges and hollows that shifted with each gust of wind. Walking in pairs allowed them to move safely through the deepening drifts. Footsteps pressed into the snow created a trail that others could follow, forming a clear path even when the wind attempted to erase it. In the forest, they also used sound to stay connected. A simple call, just a few steady words spoken into the cold air, helped maintain awareness of one another's positions. The sound did not need to travel far. The quiet of winter carried voices naturally. Even when the snow softened the ground and the wind hummed through the branches, a short call reached the ears of those who needed to hear it. Their tools played a role as well. Workers learned to handle axes and saws in ways that minimized strain during cold weather. Excessive force risked stiffening the muscles, while gentle, rhythmic motions kept the body warm and reduced the chance of injury. When a man saw another pushing too hard, he might offer a nod or a small gesture suggesting a slower pace. These exchanges contained no judgment, only a calm sense of shared understanding. Warmth was also preserved through the way they organized their rest. During breaks in the forest, men often sat or stood close enough to share body heat without crowding. The snow beneath them compressed softly, forming small hollows where footprints mingled. The stillness of the group allowed their combined warmth to settle into the air around them, reducing the cold's grip. At night, the stove served as the collective heart of these efforts. The chore boy tended the fire for everyone, ensuring that warmth filled the room so each man could recover from the day. Men rotated their drying clothes on the line, making sure that every pair of socks, every scarf, had its turn near the stove. It was an unspoken agreement, one that relied on fairness and patience. No one monopolized the warmest spots. Each person allowed the next to take his place, knowing that the cycle continued as predictably as the rising and falling of the flames. In the quiet of winter, survival became a shared rhythm. The men worked, moved, and rested as individuals, but their safety emerged from their collective awareness. The cold did not allow for isolation. It asked for steady attention, gentle cooperation, and the kind of instinctual care that grew naturally among people who spent months living side by side. Through this combination of personal skill and quiet teamwork, the loggers passed the winter with a sense of calm assurance. They learned to read the forest, their tools, and their own bodies with patience. They knew how frostbite announced itself, how warmth could be preserved through small movements, and how the shared strength of the group sustained each individual. And so, through the long nights and deep snows, the camp endured, not through force, but through the steady, thoughtful practices that turned winter from an adversary into a season met with quiet understanding and collective resilience. Break time equals 3.0 seconds. As winter reached its final weeks, the forest began to shift in ways that were quiet but unmistakable. The light lingered a little longer each afternoon. The sharpness of the morning air softened just slightly, loosening its hold on the frozen ground. And though snow still covered the landscape, its surface changed, becoming brighter in the sun and heavier underfoot. For months, the camp had moved through a steady rhythm: work, warmth, rest, and the long nights that defined the season. Now, slowly and without announcement, that rhythm began to ease. The first sign arrived with the daylight. In the heart of winter, morning waited a long time before touching the treetops. But as the season turned, light appeared earlier each day, slipping gently into the forest, spreading across the snow in pale, widening streaks. The men noticed the change without needing to speak of it. They rose from their bunks to a room touched by faint grey light instead of deep darkness. The stove still held its steady warmth, and the bunkhouse still carried the familiar sense of wool and pine, but the presence of morning felt different, like a quiet reminder that winter was preparing to give way to something else. The work itself shifted as well. Throughout the coldest months, the tasks had been heavy and constant: cutting, hauling, guiding the massive logs across packed trails. But as winter thinned, the forest changed its texture. Snow, once firm and dry, softened under the warming air. Frozen ruts in the logging roads began to lose their crisp edges, and the heavy layers of ice that had held for so long started to glisten with moisture. These changes made the work lighter in some ways and heavier in others. The logs traveled more easily over melting snow, but the ground beneath became unpredictable, sometimes firm, sometimes soft. The men adjusted naturally to these shifts. Their bodies, conditioned by months of labor, moved with practiced ease. They completed the tasks that remained, stacking the last of the timber and preparing the trails for the final stage of winter work: the river drive. This was the moment they had been preparing for since the cold first settled over the camp. All winter long, they had felled trees, trimmed them, and positioned them near frozen waterways. Now, as the ice began to weaken and the first signs of thaw appeared along the riverbanks, the work of moving those logs toward the water began quietly. The river did not thaw all at once. It changed slowly, beginning with small cracks near the edges where sunlight touched the ice most directly. Water, once trapped under the frozen surface, began to flow again, moving with a faint, steady murmur. As the days passed, these cracks widened, allowing the men to judge how soon the river could carry the timber. The forest listened to these changes with its usual patience. Snow fell less often, and when it did, it melted quickly, soaking into the ground instead of resting lightly on top. Inside the bunkhouse, the atmosphere shifted as well. Clothing dried more quickly near the stove. Boots placed along the wall softened from the warmth, their leather absorbing moisture more easily now that the air held a hint of spring. The men spoke softly of the coming weeks, not with anticipation or urgency, but simply acknowledging the natural end of the season. They moved through their routines with the same quiet steadiness they had maintained since the first snow, though now each action carried an added sense of preparation. As the thaw grew stronger, the camp began to empty gradually. Some men left early to assist with downstream preparations. Others stayed behind to complete the final tasks within the forest. Each departure was simple and unceremonious. a man folded his blankets, gathered his tools, checked his boots, and stepped outside into the softening snow. There were no farewells, only nods and quiet acknowledgements. The forest absorbed their steps as they walked away, and the bunkhouse, still warm from the stove, watched them go in calm silence. Day by day, the long room grew emptier. The bunks that once held layers of blankets and scattered personal items now lay bare, their wooden frames cool to the touch. The drying line above the stove sagged lightly with the weight of fewer garments. The air inside the bunkhouse remained warm, but the sounds changed. The familiar mix of low voices, the steady thud of boots, and the soft rustle of clothing settled into a quieter pattern. The large space, even with the stove still burning, felt more spacious now that fewer men filled it. The stove, too, began a gradual transition. Though it continued to burn through the final cool nights, the intensity of the fire softened. Less wood was needed. The chore boy tended it with the same care as always, but the rhythm of adding logs grew slower, less frequent. The warmth in the bunkhouse spread more gently now, no longer pushing back the fierce cold of deep winter, but simply maintaining comfort as the season shifted. Even the scent of the smoke changed slightly, mixing with the dampness of melting snow that drifted in each time the door opened. Outside, the camp transformed with the thaw. Snow receded from the bases of the trees, revealing patches of earth softened by moisture. The trails that had been used all winter turned into shallow channels where water pooled gently. The stable, once filled with the steady presence of horses, grew quiet as the animals were moved toward river routes or neighboring camps. Tools were cleaned and stored. Sleds used to haul logs were pulled aside, ready to dry in the lengthening light. In the evenings, the bunkhouse took on a new kind of quiet. Fewer bunks were occupied. The sounds of movement diminished. The stove's glow lit a smaller circle of space, reaching fewer faces than before. The remaining men sat on their bunks or along the central walkway, speaking softly about their tasks for the next day, or simply listening to the wind settling gently against the roof. The room no longer carried the dense warmth of midwinter nights, but held a calm, balanced air, as though it too were preparing for rest after a long season of work. Eventually the final day arrived. The bunkhouse, once filled with so many men, now held only a handful. They folded the last blankets, swept the floor, and ensured the stove was safely extinguished. The room, clean and quiet, echoed faintly with the memory of voices and warmth. Outside, the thawing forest waited in calm stillness. When the last men stepped out of the bunkhouse and closed the door behind them, winter had nearly released its hold. The snow still lay across the landscape, but it carried a softness that signaled the season's end. The river moved slowly in the distance, preparing for the coming work of carrying hundreds of logs downstream. And the bunkhouse stood alone, its roof still strong beneath the remaining snow, its walls solid, its interior at rest. It would remain there through spring, summer, and autumn, waiting in silence for the next winter, when new workers would return, light the stove once more, and fill the room with warmth, steady breath, and the soft rhythm of life in the northern woods. When the last footsteps faded into the soft, thawing snow and the bunkhouse settled into silence, the forest reclaimed its stillness. For months, it had been the center of human warmth in the deep winter woods, a place where the cold paused at the threshold and where steady heat pushed back against the frozen world outside. Now, as the season turned and the river began its slow awakening, the bunkhouse stood alone, holding the memory of all the nights it had sheltered those who passed through its long room. Its presence in the forest had never been loud. Built from the trees that surrounded it, shaped by hands familiar with cold, and standing low against the winter wind, the bunkhouse blended into the landscape even while sustaining 100 lives within its walls. Through the darkest stretches of winter, it served as a quiet shield, an unspoken promise that beyond the hard labor of each day, there would be a place of warmth, dryness, and rest. The logs that formed its walls had been chosen carefully from the forest, shaped through calm effort, and fitted together with the kind of precision that only patience could achieve. Each log carried the story of steady hands, hands that peeled bark in the cool air of early autumn, hands that carved notches, hands that lifted and guided the wood into place. Over time, the layers stacked upward, creating the sturdy frame that would hold firm against months of wind and frost. The roof, with its birch bark and sod, had gathered snow as winter deepened, becoming heavier and quieter with each storm. At night, lantern light glowed softly through the frost-rimmed windows, while the snow above absorbed every sound, muffling the world into a deep hush. The structure held this weight without strain, letting the snow become part of the warmth, another layer of insulation resting gently on the roof, working in harmony with the materials beneath it. Inside, the long iron stove had been the heart of the room. Its slow, even heat reached the farthest corners, softening the air for those who slept beneath blankets and wool layers. The stove's warmth drifted upward, filling the spaces between the rafters and settling along the bunkhouse walls in gentle currents. In the coldest nights, when the forest outside lay motionless under the weight of winter, this warmth made survival possible. It allowed the men to rest without fear of the temperature outside, offering the comfort their bodies needed to endure another day of work. Throughout the season, the bunkhouse had held a kind of quiet order. Boots lined the walls in steady rows. Mittens and scarves swayed softly from the drying line above the stove. The walkway through the center of the room remained clear, shaped by the countless footsteps that moved along it each morning and evening. Even the smell of the space became part of its stillness. The faint scent of pine smoke, wool drying slowly, and the subtle breath of dozens of people sharing the same daily rhythm. The bunkhouse did not make the winter easy. It simply made it possible. It offered the constant, reliable warmth that long days in the cold demanded. It sheltered men after hours of labor in deep snow. It held the quiet routines, drying clothes, tending tools, sharing small conversations that kept the camp moving at a steady, sustainable pace. And it did all of this silently, its presence made stable by the forest that surrounded it. When the workers left at the end of the season, they carried with them a memory of evenings spent in the warm glow of the stove, of mornings that began with breath drifting into the cold air, and of nights when the storm winds could be heard brushing softly against the walls. They left behind bunks neatly arranged, tools stored for another year, and a room that had been filled with the slow heartbeat of winter life. As spring strengthened, the bunkhouse remained where it had been built, watching the snow melt into the streams and the ice break along the river. Its logs absorbed the changing air, creaking softly as they adjusted from cold to gentle warmth. The clearing around it began to show signs of green. The trails that had echoed with the steady rhythm of boots grew quiet once more. Birds returned, building small nests in the sheltered spaces beneath the eaves. The bunkhouse, though empty, continued its quiet work of simply existing, patient, grounded, and steady. Through the warmer seasons, the bunkhouse stood as a silent witness to the forest's renewal. Rain softened the remaining snow. Soft grasses emerged along the path leading to the door. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting gentle patterns across the logs and roof. During this time, the building seemed to rest, not in sleep, but in a long, deep stillness, holding its strength in preparation for the season that would eventually return. Because winter always returned. When the first cool winds of autumn swept through the forest, the bunkhouse greeted them not with resistance, but with familiarity. Its logs, seasoned by years of cold, tightened slightly as temperatures dropped. The roof, once heavy with snow, waited calmly for its next burden. The stove, dark and silent through spring and summer, held the memory of flames that had warmed so many nights. And the wide, even floor, whether packed earth or smooth planks, remained ready for the steady footsteps that would fill it again. Each winter brought new workers and new routines, but the bunkhouse stayed the same, a place built not to impress or overwhelm, but to protect. It formed the quiet center of the camp, the stable point around which the entire season revolved. Without it, the forest's cold would become too deep, its nights too long. With it, the winter became a landscape that could be endured, slowly, patiently, one day at a time. In this way, the bunkhouse served not only as a building but as a symbol. It represented the practical resilience of those who worked in the northern woods, the calm cooperation that shaped each day, and the steady coexistence between people and the forest they depended upon. Its existence spoke of effort that did not seek recognition, of work done with simple purpose, and of the quiet balance between shelter and wilderness. Long after the last worker left each year, the bunkhouse remained as the heart of the winter that had passed. It held the memory of warmth shared by many, of tools laid carefully at day's end, of clothing hanging above the stove, and of the soft, layered breathing of men asleep under heavy blankets while the snow fell endlessly outside. And when winter returned, as it always did, the bunkhouse welcomed it with the same steady patience. Snow gathered on the roof. Frost traced gentle patterns on the windows. The stove glowed again at the center of the room. Boots filled the walkway. Coats and mittens swayed lightly above the fire. The quiet rhythm of winter life began once more. Through the seasons and the years, the bunkhouse remained what it had always been. A calm, grounded shield in the heart of the frozen forest, a gentle protector during the longest nights, and a quiet symbol of survival, labor, and the slow, enduring rhythm of life in the northern woods.